We begin in the name of God, peace be upon you. Welcome to another episode of From the Desk of Ghamidi. We continue the discussion on the 23 questions series, and we are about to begin the 112th episode on the objection regarding Meezan and Furqan. Thank you, Ghamidi Sahab, for your presence in this fifth part of this discussion. You shared your view that the Qur'an is Meezan, Furqan, Muhaymin, ultimate authority and absolute truth. The Qur'an holds the ultimate authority to resolve any disputes. You've laid out your viewpoint for us. All the relevant verses from the Qur'an were discussed by you. Among these verses, the verse which was being questioned was the verse about Meezan. It has been stated that you claimed Meezan as a characteristic of the Qur'an. This assertion was challenged. What does Meezan mean in the Qur'an, and how does context of the verse support the interpretation that Ghamidi Sahab has advanced? All aspects of the sentence were being discussed. Our discussion commenced with the letter wow, indicating that wow is used here. It's noted that it typically serves to connect two different elements. You had discussed this point beautifully and explained that although this term is not used by exegetes, but they are indeed familiar with the fundamental concept. Specifically, you mentioned a verse and referred to Zamakhshari, where the identical words kitab and Furqan were utilized. The initial question in today's session for you is about your citation of the Imam of linguistics, Zamakhshari, to support your complete argument that he was aware of the explanatory vowel. But why didn't you share Zamakhshari's view on the verse in your last discussion?
On the various points where I have cited an exegete like Zamakhshari, or Ibn Kathir, or others, the reason to quote them was to illuminate a principle. That is, I cited them to demonstrate that this is a rule of the Arabic language, and this is how a word is perceived within this framework. How case endings are interpreted and how a sentence structure is considered. The method of referring to someone to invoke specific rules, this is the usual practice in scholarship. That's how it's done. That is, you might directly refer to the literature of the Arabs, or if the topic is about vocabulary, then you consult the authorities. Or if it pertains to grammar, then grammar specialists are consulted, and if it concerns exegetical matters, then you invoke expert exegetes. The point is there's a foundational principle, and matters are considered according to those principles. There might be varying terms used, yet the essence is acknowledged. This is the reason that Zamakhshari was brought into the conversation, or why I mentioned Ibn Kathir. Whether he applies a certain principle on a specific matter or not, this needs a detailed examination. And in such detailed discussions, there can be scholarly disagreements. Consider it like this. When discussing the scholars of Hadith, we examine if there are established principles and terminology employed to scrutinize a narration. There's usually consensus on the terminology, and often on the principles as well. And if there are differences regarding the principles, they're also clarified. However, after having applied these principles, which narrations were accepted by Imam Bukhari and which were rejected by him, doesn't necessitate an additional reference, since deciding what to accept or reject is the question under discussion. If I adhere to the notion that for any viewpoint I adopt, it must always align with that of an earlier authority, then the entire purpose of addressing these 23 objections would have been defeated.
Understood.
Thus, this isn't the topic at hand, nor is it needed here. It's their method. They embrace a particular principle, and when that principle became a focal point, as it was necessary there, and there's no alternative means available, there as well he used a technique of expansive interpretation and conveyed the same idea. I cited the phrase Nurun wa kitabun mubinun, referring to Zamakhshari, and I had highlighted that two interpretations are possible, yet he chose not to even acknowledge the alternative. Namely, one interpretation does exist which suggests that Nur symbolizes our esteemed Prophet Muhammad.
Okay.
And this interpretation logically follows if we interpret the wow as a conjunction, yet he chose not to reference it or acknowledge it, to the point where he didn't even note that some believe this interpretation exists. The goal was to clarify the point that our scholars are acquainted with this method and how it manifests in their discourse. When they articulate a view, they substantiate it with examples and precedents. In fact, they further expound upon these using those examples. Still, if at some point they have preferred a different explanation, then I have also shared that with you. If they interpret it in terms of justice, or like many scholars view it, as Sharia, or even in our own times, Maulana Abul Maududi interprets it as Sharia. Thus, these are interpretative disagreements, and it is because of these that we are not merely presenting our perspective, we are also presenting our rationale. As regards the rules, the principles, and the various linguistic styles, there are essentially two possibilities. It could be the language of the Arabs or the views of language experts. And it was in that vein that I referenced Mubni al-Labib and Zamakhshari too.
Okay, Gandhi Sahab, when you reference Zamakhshari, it's clear you are highlighting a rule accepted by the exegetes. They concur that "Atfi shay'an ala muradi fih" applies here, or as others have described it using different terms, though the essence remains unchanged. If someone asserts that Zamakhshari is a master of language, he is deeply knowledgeable in linguistics. He is fundamentally aware of this principle, which you've also cited. So a layperson might wonder about an exegete who might not be a linguist, who views the discourse through a logical lens, yet a person who is recognized for his mastery of language and interpretation. And not just him, but many who are acquainted with these rules, despite everything. Why do they not proclaim the Qur'an as Meezan in that verse?
It's not at all surprising, truly. Nor should it be seen as implausible. One person reflects on the Qur'an or a hadith and settles on an interpretation. Once content, he does not apply other principles, nor did he explore other possibilities. They were satisfied with Nuram wa Kitabun Mubain, believing that pointing to two separate entities isn't even worth mentioning, so they didn't. What can one say in that case? This is a common occurrence in scholarship. There's nothing shocking about it.
Okay, Gandhi Sahab, if you were asked whether the Quran is a Meezan or not, you'd affirm that it certainly is. However, if one queries whether it serves as a Meezan for historical events or occurrences, you'd respond that it functions as a Meezan solely in religious contexts. Thus, you also impose a limitation in the Quran, stating it serves as a scale for religious aspects while you apply different criteria for historical accounts, intellectual concerns, and various other issues. You set one boundary while Maulana Maududi sets another, meaning regardless, anyone interpreting Quran will be imposing some constraints.
No, these limitations are imposed by the Quran itself, which I am conveying. I did not invent them. Quran itself asserts that it is here for guiding humanity. It acts as a reminder. It forewarns us about Judgment Day. It explains the divine law, God's own Sharia. It has explicitly stated that its teachings are founded on two things.
Right.
One is the wisdom which explains the nature of the universe, who I am, who its creator is, and my accountability to him. Following this, the resultant moral framework emerges, and the second aspect is the law and the Sharia. Thus, it defines its own scope. Naturally, it is referenced within this scope. It will be consulted in this scope, especially when there is no worldly matter to resolve. Then, we will turn to God's book. The role of defining what the Quran's message is not mine to dictate to the Quran. Rather, the Quran instructs us. And whatever it dictates, it will be consulted therein. It never claims to reveal scientific truths. It does not purport to instruct us on business strategy. These topics are never discussed by the Quran. The subjects that constitute the Quran's focus are the directives from God, on which success in the afterlife depends. If a topic is chosen for our guidance, and it pertains to history, then it is the ultimate authority thereto. If it concerns a philosophical matter, thereto it is definitive. If it regards a scientific fact, thereto it is the final authority. Therefore, the Quran decides what its concerns are.
Right.
Essentially, the themes of the Quran are guidance, purification of an individual, and his or her eternal success. With this goal, it might discuss myriad other topics. Whichever subject it opts to discuss, it has the final say on it.
Okay, Gandhi Sahab. Hence, it would be correct to assert that historical events over which there is contention and somehow relate to religious traditions. Like the numerous Israelite stories that exist in matters of religion or prophetic traditions, people differ in their interpretations. Yet, the Quran does not adjudicate between them as right or wrong.
It certainly does, because any tradition will yield a certain outcome. This outcome will inevitably affect the religion. If it influences our religion, then guidance for the religion is provided to us.
A very important point.
That is, it's possible that we might logically demonstrate its fallacy. It may not even require referencing the Quran, since every individual is endowed with reason. If something is inherently illogical or incorrect, why would one need to consult the Quran? However, if an issue arises that surpasses human understanding, that is, divine judgment is necessary, then we would turn to the Quran. It would clarify the conclusion drawn from this event, or the event used to support a claim, if it pertains to religion. If it's unrelated, then our Prophet has guided us. لَا نُكَذِّبُ وَلَا نُصَدِّقُ. It is an incident related by someone. What difference does it make? When it impacts my religion, then it may transform into religious dispute, and when it becomes one, then I would address it using my reason, which God has granted to every individual. If it's beyond something resolvable by reason, then I would refer to God. How do I refer to God? Would I sit and pray about it? Or wait for divine revelation? Or begin meditating? No, I'll consult God's book, which will settle the issue.
Okay, Ghamidi Sahab, regarding religious disagreements, we observe that all disputes in the interpretation of religion stem from foundational principles. There are jurisprudential differences. Different schools exist. There are varied interpretations, methodologies for decoding the Quran's verses. Some principles are established by individuals. Now, if the Quran is Mizan, especially concerning the religion, then what greater matter of religion could there be than ensuring the principles for understanding the Quran are validated and qualified based on standards set by the Quran? So does the Quran also serve as the Mizan for disputes on the principles of jurisprudence?
For every field of study, the first consideration should be to scrutinize the basis on which its principles are formed. If they stem from a logical premise, then they should be evaluated based on rationality. If they concern technical aspects, for instance, principles for understanding language, then the universal truths of language apply. That is, we must consider the words, their uses, and sentence structure. Decisions in such cases are made by experts of that field. There's no need to invoke God in this context.
Right.
It pertains to worldly matters. That is, the realm in which our intellect leads us is in fact that orbit where we do not need divine guidance. However, if a principle-based issue arises, namely, the religion is invoked to support or oppose a view, or a religious tradition is cited, or statements are made invoking the prophets, then in such cases, the Quran becomes decisive. Thus, what matters here is what is the nature of the issue. That is, what principle have you developed, and what is the goal and basis for it? For instance, the criteria for evaluating hadiths, the methodologies for formulating these are based on common sense. That is, when we examine these principles, it's this. Someone comes forward and shares information. We evaluate who this person is, isn't it? His reputation and character. Usually, when we want to investigate any issue, we follow the standard procedures for identifying credible witnesses.
Right.
This isn't something for which we need to consult a book or turn to God's guidance. However, consider when a religious dimension emerges that we must discuss the reputations and characters of individuals. We need to highlight their flaws. So for this, we take the verse from Surah Hujurat as the basis.
An excellent illustration.
Thus, when scholars search for a verse of the Quran to scrutinize hadith narrators, they turn to the verse from Surah Al-Hujurat that if a wicked person brings you news, verify it first. So, what would be the criteria for verification? These, of course, are based on common sense. That is, wherever arguments need a divine command, such command can only be found in the Quran. That is, at points where something beyond our intellect is required, or when there is a dispute regarding some aspect of religion where the mind cannot conclusively decide. What's the matter here? The issue is that if we delve into it, our intellect initially guides us. On the other hand, from an ethical standpoint, it's argued that one should hide others' faults rather than announce them, whereas in hadith studies, one not only states them but reports them in books, so that future generations know that this person was a liar or boastful or dishonest. So, a question arose and people took guidance from the Quran, and based on it developed an entire scholarly discipline.
Ghamidi Sahab, I'd like you to clarify another example. In our books on principles of jurisprudence, there are debates over different interpretations of words. For instance, types of textual proofs like ibaratun nas, isharatun nas, iqtida'un nas, where if one person says there are only 2 types, and another claims there are 6 types, then this is a debate about understanding the words of the Quran itself. Will the Quran act as a mizan in such cases?
No. This issue pertains to the general principles of language. Wherever we study a text, anywhere in the world, we have to consider all these aspects. We sometimes suppose that these things have some religious significance.
Okay.
Like how a word is unequivocal too. Sometimes it is apparent, latent, or complex by its nature. It can embody all these, and this is true in every language. This exists in Urdu as well as in English, and such rules must be established for each language. Books of grammar are needed for Urdu too. In Urdu, we also need a book like Rules of Urdu Grammar, so that the way to approach the language is clarified. Hence, the stated rules are related to language. Similarly, if someone has to draft a legal document, what will be the register of words used? What will be the interpretation of the text? What interpretation will be derived from its intent or its implications? These discussions are common. Hence, these debates pertain to language, and they are completely unrelated to religion. Since we see the language in the form of the garment which God has dressed up his revelation, therefore, we will refer to linguistic rules. It was this concern that I responded to, that wherever a rule is discussed, the first thing to check is the foundation on which it's based. No rule among these is such as to have been established based on a religious directive. These principles or rules are, in fact, based on the knowledge related to human language. These principles and rules are tested on that basis. For example, we don't accept in principle the 8 types of a word generally claimed. Why? Is it because there aren't as many types of words as stated? These types certainly exist, however. These are types of words. When the word becomes a part of a discourse, then these types may not apply.
It's a question of reason.
It is a question of reason, so we evaluate it based on logic. When something concerns the senses, we consider those too. That is, in the matter of praying, in deciding whether the time for Zohar prayer has started. Have you ever seen someone in their right mind opening the Qur'an to find this out?
No.
The position of the sun is observed here, so this matter pertains to our senses. The issue discussed is related to the observation of our senses. We consult them. If it pertains to intellect, we apply intellectual means. If it's a historical matter, we refer to history. The Qur'an is consulted for those issues that surpass our understanding and require divine guidance. That is, divine guidance should be applicable in such instances, and it should be conclusive and definite.
Okay, Ghamidi Sahab, another issue I want to bring up. There's a significant disagreement among us, a religious one. When you assert that the Qur'an is Meezan, then some disputes can be cited to ask how the Qur'an serves as a Meezan. Consider interest. There are variations among us in its definition. In its interpretation among the scholars of jurisprudence, the Qur'an explicitly prohibits demanding interest. What is the specific thing that should not be consumed? There's considerable debate about this, so it's a religious dispute, and one that impedes adherence to religious guidance. Shouldn't it have been decided by the Qur'an?
The Qur'an has rendered its verdict. That is, the Qur'an will render its judgment, but it won't enforce compliance. We must consult it. This judgment is distinctly clear in the Qur'an. Not only is it clear in terms of its language, not just in how it is commonly understood, but also in how the Qur'an elaborates on the law, through which it becomes completely apparent.
Right.
Thus the Qur'an delivers its judgment. The disputes arise over its interpretation.
Okay.
When disagreement stems from interpretation, then the factors on which the understanding relies. If it's about a word, then obviously the debate will focus on its linguistic usage. If it concerns the particular sentence structure, then the discussion will be about syntax. Hence, those academic fields are consulted. In reality, in those cases, we often make a mistake in utilizing the means of knowledge that are available to us.
Right.
Such errors can be pointed out. The divine judgment is sought for those matters that transcend the capacity of our knowledge and intellect. In such cases, divine judgment is essential.
Okay, Ghamidi Sahab, I bring up another point to you. I had asked you some days ago, some people interpret the term Torah in the Quran as referring to law and not as a specific book per God. You said that if there are clear principles of knowledge and intellect and established historical facts, the Quran does not initiate such discussions. Now, when there's a dispute over the meaning of Torah, we won't consult the Quran for a verdict. But if it's based on established historical facts or clear principles of knowledge and intellect, then these things will serve as Meezan.
These have been established already. It doesn't mean that it's forbidden by God Almighty to refer to all those fields of study, all those sciences that we consult in our daily lives.
Right.
That is, if it's a matter related to science, then a reputable scientist would be consulted. For instance, the Quran states that human creation underwent various stages.
Yes.
Clearly, if we wish to examine our understanding on it, that is, if we want to investigate how it occurred through physical science and experimentation, then we refer to scientific disciplines to verify it. So, if something pertains to a specific field of science, then that field will be consulted. That is, how else would we interpret it? For instance, if we need to know the meaning of a word, should I consult the Quran instead of a lexicon? Thus, for vocabulary, expert lexicographers would be consulted. For syntax and grammar, linguists would be consulted. Have such objections also been raised by some people? It's astounding the level we've reached. One only wonders. The Quran as a Meezan implies those issues which exceed our intellectual capacity, and we lack the means to resolve them. And if the interpretation of a religious matter becomes contentious, what will be the definitive truth for me? It's the book of God, the Quran, and it is up to the Quran to decide what topics it addresses and which it does not. It's not my role to dictate themes to the Quran because I encounter a particular difficulty.
Right.
Thus, the Quran has outlined its domain, the scope of its guidance, and naturally it becomes the reference in those areas. And when it establishes something as its subject, it then assumes authority over it. And I should also mention regarding these sciences, if the Qur'an incidentally comments on any of these sciences, it becomes the Meezan there too.
Right. Okay, Ghamidi Sahab, let's continue the discussion. Please elaborate. Often when we consult your religious writings, the term Sunnah frequently appears alongside the Qur'an. You often state that from the two sources of the religion, which originated from the personality of the Prophet, there's the Qur'an and Sunnah. And it's commonly stated that we must evaluate things based on the Meezan of Qur'an and Sunnah. So in asserting the Qur'an as Meezan, are you also denying the Sunnah as Meezan?
The Sunnah is recognized based on the Meezan of the Qur'an itself. That is, the Book of God was received from the Prophet. God's book was transmitted to us in the most secure manner. While the Prophet, peace be upon him, was in this world, naturally, the sequence was such that he was the primary source of our guidance.
Right.
People took the Prophet as their primary religious source. From him, we received the Book of God too, and directions to practice certain things, such as prayer, fasting, and the various etiquettes which Muslims adopted, having attributed them to the Prophet, peace be upon him. These are recognized among Muslims, transmitted through their consensus and perpetual adherence. When these practices became known to us, now, when we are in a time beyond the Prophet's life, questions arose about their authenticity and their origins. If these are mentioned in the Quran, what then is their relationship? And if not, then why are they omitted? These questions were raised. There too he referred to the Quran. The Quran explained their significance. The Quran clarified why it provided these directives. The Quran recounted their history. The Quran elucidated the role of our Prophet, and the Quran instructed us on how to integrate them into our lives. Therefore, the Sunnah too had to be validated through the Quran's Meezan. Thus, everyone follows the same method. When you question the Sunnah of the Messenger, firstly, the discussion focuses on Quranic verses. There, the role of the Messenger is described.
Right.
When you ask us, we too will explain that on such occasions, the Quran not only mentions these practices, it not only instructs us to follow them, but also lays out the rules and principles concerning them. Thus, the basis for accepting the Sunnah is the Quran itself. That is, as a historical fact, it has reached us as narrated by the Prophet of God. However, in the presence of the Book of God, when any dispute about it arises, if there is no dispute, no issue. When they do emerge, the Quran alone will decide. The Quran alone is invoked by the whole community for reasoning. Even today, the reasoning will be done based on Quran. Thus, when the Quran determines if something foreign to it exists, then what is its status? And where has it come from? So, all these matters have been thoroughly clarified by the Quran. Using that response, we have acknowledged the status of the Sunnah, that it is a unique, sui generis source preceding the Quran, and its directives require obligatory compliance just like those of the Quran. And the mode of its transmission is also the same. That is, the Quran too was conveyed with verbal and continuous adherence, and the entire community accepts it by consensus. The same applies to the Sunnah. That is, we have clearly and definitively explained that it too is transmitted through consensus and perpetual adherence, and it aligns with the entire body of knowledge held by Muslims. This conclusion is also derived based on the Quran. Now, when something is verified from all perspectives, that is, it perfectly aligns with the Meezan, then it becomes a Meezan itself, at a secondary level.
Subhanallah.
You see, I'll illustrate this with an example. I used a meter gauge to measure a cloth of 1 meter length. After the measurement, you took the gauge away. Now, I will use that 1 meter length cloth to measure the entire batch.
Now the cloth became the gauge.
The cloth becomes the meter gauge, because that cloth has been authenticated by that standard meter.
How interesting.
Say, I measured out 1 kg of something for you. Afterward, the scale was taken away. Now, that measure remains with me. Based on that standard, I continue to give you 1 kg units. Thus, if the Quran, the Book of God, certifies something as correct in all aspects, that is, it has been assessed on its Meezan and found acceptable, then it itself becomes a prototype for Meezan. Why is this far-fetched?
A compelling argument. Ghamidi Sahab, you've touched on a very nuanced point here. I'll pose another scenario. Consider a clear example of a religious dispute where it appears that the Quran does not serve as the Meezan, but rather the Sunnah does. Take, for example, Rafa al-Yadayn. You've stated that the prayer has been transmitted through the ijma and tawatur of the Sunnah. And the Quran does not address this practice directly, since it was well known and already being practiced. So concerning the dispute over Rafa al-Yadin, then the Sunnah would serve as the Meezan here. The Quran does not figure into this situation.
It is the Quran which explicitly told us that these are worship practices in the Abrahamic tradition. It declares these were practiced by the Prophet. It acknowledges that their origin predates the Prophet. They were practiced by all the prophets. All these details have been provided by the Quran. I'll summarize it. It asserts that the religion of Islam did not start with Muhammad, the messenger of God.
Right.
It articulates that this has been the religion of God from the beginning. It declares that in this religion, prayer and fasting have always existed. This is articulated in several places. I have detailed its complete history in my book Meezan, drawing from the verses of the Quran. It lists the names of all the prophets in one section, and it informs us that we have instructed our prophet to adhere to the religious tradition which these prophets established. Following this, it states that at the time when this prophethood commenced, that is, when the prophethood of Muhammad, the messenger of God, began, we instructed him right at the start, that is, concerning the religion of Abraham, he was to conduct affairs in alignment with it, and he was to fulfill these obligations as well. Thus, these directions became the commands of the Quran. That is, the prophet, by following the directive of the Quran, is fulfilling these duties as part of his obedience to the initial command. Subsequently, it's about conveying what he has implemented. Now its status has been established by the Quran. That has become the religion. We are obligated to follow them. Thus the debate ends here. Now it just needs to reach to us. So I said it has been passed down through ijma and tawatur. Therefore, whatever sunnah has been transmitted is through ijma and tawatur. Thus there is no room for disagreement over them, nor has there been any. I had listed them in 2007 in my book. You've seen the lists of objections made against me and read books discussing them. However, has anyone objected that something should not have been included? Therefore, it indicates that it is a list accepted by everyone. That is, everything listed there is universally agreed upon. So there is no disagreement about it. Once there is no disagreement, it signifies that the issue of Rafa al-Yadayn is neither related to Quran nor Sunnah. Rather, it sprung from isolated hadith reports.
Okay.
When this issue emerged from isolated reports, we must examine its nature. Is it feasible? Then the Quran provides a solution. It states that those practices in religion attributed to the Prophet may be performed optionally. Based on this principle, I have further elaborated it and assigned a status to it in my book. You will find similar treatment for other issues too. The Quran will set forth a principle, and in light of that, we determine whether to accept it or not. These principles have been outlined by the Quran. Thus, it is not necessary for the Quran to specifically rule on every issue. At times, it sets forth a general principle, and using that, we can reach a conclusion.
Excellent. Let me offer another example for consideration. Regarding Zakat, there is a religious dispute. What items are subject to Zakat? We see that two major schools of thought among Muslims differ. Should Zakat be applied only to items that were taxable in the Prophet's time? Or should it also apply to modern forms of wealth like currency notes? This is a religious dispute. The decisive stance will be that of the Sunnah. But who ultimately decides?
This is not a religious difference. This difference stems from understanding. Like when there's a dispute over a Quranic verse, when understanding a verse of the Quran becomes contentious. If the disagreement concerns the wording, then lexicographers would be consulted. If about sentence structure, then linguists. What's the contentious issue here? It's that when a directive is issued, does it pertain to its literal meaning or its underlying essence? This is purely an intellectual and scholarly discussion. Therefore, from it, both the opinion and conclusion are derived. Why must we await God's verdict in this? It was under the Prophet's guidance that Zakat was directed, setting a precedent for us. We must understand this and apply it to contemporary times, all matters related to contemporary application, like, for example, whether Zakat applies to currency notes or not, just as it did for gold and silver. And was the matter specifically concerning money, or was it about precious metal? Therefore, these disagreements are similar to those found in interpreting the Quran. Thus, the principles of logic and the rules of grammar and language are what come into play. Depending on the field of knowledge or the academic discipline or the faculty that led to the disagreement, that will be the one consulted. Why seek a divine decree on this?
Let's proceed, Ghamidi Sahab. You mentioned that the Quran is Furqan too. It's often said that when we claim the Quran is also Furqan, isn't it more accurate to say the Quran is Furqan specifically in matters of beliefs, since many aspects are covered by the Sunnah? and we would refer to the Sunnah therein. Many matters pertain to historical events, where we turn to narratives. Thus, when the Qur'an is termed the Furqan, why can't it be stated that it is Furqan solely concerning fundamental beliefs like creed, monotheism, and polytheism, while for other matters, other sources are referred to?
Whenever you place a limitation on the statement of God, such a specification must be necessitated by the language, or by convention, or by the clear principles of reason. What does this demand stem from? I have made a simple point, that the issues that the Qur'an chooses to address, it acts as Furqan for those matters. It is the Qur'an's discretion. How can I impose such a limitation? And for those who attempt to impose it, what is their rationale? The Qur'an declares itself as the criterion for discerning truth from falsehood. I have brought forward statements from respected scholars. They say that it delineates what is permissible and what is not between guidance and misguidance. They assert that in all matters requiring its judgment, it will provide it. So I have clearly stated that for those issues which the Qur'an has made its subject, and those it considers part of religion, should any disagreement arise, in cases where we need divine guidance to resolve them, it will render a judgment in all such instances.
You have once again explained this beautifully. Our program's time is almost over. There are some basic questions. Example, there's a warning from the Prophet that those who assert that the Qur'an is sufficient for them, because alongside the Qur'an, another similar authority has been given to me, and I foresee that people will complacently dismiss it and refuse to accept it. In the same way, it is argued that while you acknowledge it as Meezan, however, after accepting, according to your interpretation and your established rules about the Qur'an's thematic structure, you apply it in your own way. How then does the Qur'an remain the Meezan? We will discuss all these topics. Our time is up for now, but we will return to serve you again. Thank you for your time thus far.
Many thanks.